finally, a source of raw, real, and honest information on healthcare issues that matter most. Welcome to BS-Free MD. From the latest medical information to how to stay sane as a doctor or a patient, no subject is taboo, and no BS is allowed. Now, let's welcome your hosts, Drs. May and Tim Hindmarsh.
All right, this week we have the awesome privilege of interviewing Dr. Peter Breggin. This is going to be, this is a really interesting interview, and if it's nothing else, it is thought-provoking. Really interesting time, just a delightful human being to spend some time with. Dr. Breggin is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and former consultant at NIMH and for the FAA. He's known as the Conscience of Psychiatry for his many decades of successful efforts to reform the mental health field. He's the author of 24 medical, scientific, and best-selling popular books. Really an interesting man, very passionate and very driven by, what's the right thing to do for patients. So before we dig in deep here with Dr. Breggin, May has a word from our sponsor.
This week, our sponsor is CareCloud. As a physician, you can routinely check your patient's health. But when was the last time you checked the financial health of your practice? You could be needlessly losing money right now. Stop bleeding money.
Stop bleeding money!
Get actionable insights about your group's financial performance with the free, no-strings-attached assessment from CareCloud, a leader in medical billing solutions, EHR, and more. CareCloud has over 20 years' experience helping large and small providers boost profitability and has helped thousands of practices optimize their financial operations. Request your free revenue cycle assessment and learn more about your group's performance by visiting drpodcastnetwork.com/carecloud. That's drpodcastnetwork.com/carecloud. That's spelt with a C. CareCloud.
So today we have the awesome privilege of having Peter Breggin join us, who has a really interesting history. He has been a psychiatrist for decades, practiced during psychosurgery, saw the emergence of psychotropic medications, and really has some awesome opinions about what's going on and what's gone on in psychiatry, and then how this, really shows us kind of what the backstory is with a lot of what's going on with COVID. So welcome, Dr. Breggin.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here with both of you. You're a doctor team. Ginger and I are like a doctor team, but she's a self-taught doctor, but we could be a doctor team together. It's inspiring to see you do it. I go back, yes, a long ways. When I started in psychiatry, I was actually a college freshman at Harvard. I got invited to join this new volunteer program, and I spent 4 years of college spending more time and working with mental patients on back wards at a state mental hospital, visiting other state mental hospitals than I did probably on my studies. This was my studies, and I did most of my reading on my own around what I was seeing. The abuse of the patients, which was very similar to my Uncle Dutch's descriptions of Nazi concentration, extermination camps, these giant hospitals. And there's even a historic connection between psychiatry, the state mental hospitals, and the beginning of the Holocaust that I've written about and even lectured about in Germany. So very early on, I went into psychiatry seeing there was this awful thing going on, but that we young volunteers were helping people get out of the hospital, literally. We had a program that was written up as a model program by what is probably the last document put out by the federal government in 1962. That was a psychosocial approach to psychiatry. And I went into to psychiatry thinking there was lots of room for reform and that I was already accepted into medical school in good part on the basis of the work I'd done in these hospitals, and the Harvard professors I knew as a result of it. But it became very clear through medical school, and then in my first 2 years after my psych training, which was I was at NIMH, just a little before Fauci came to NIH. I was at NIMH, which is a part of NIH, and I just saw this drug companies taking over everything. So there was no longer any social psychiatry. There was no longer any psychoanalytic psychiatry. It was all becoming the drugs. And I got invited to stay and work in the children's portion, which is a very reform-minded portion at the time of the National Institute of Mental Health. And I actually accepted, and then I thought to myself, no, this is impossible. I can't do this without kowtowing to the pharmaceutical industry. And it struck me as really interesting that Fauci comes in just a couple of years later into the National Institute of Health, in the same position as me, as probably a lieutenant commander in the United States Public Health Service. And he sees that same thing, that it's becoming, that the way of NIH is going to be kowtowing to the drug companies, and he just grabs it and runs with it. And I ran from it. So it's a kind of an interesting a notion, but I think it's quite accurate, actually.
Right. Well, I think it is, though. It's interesting because I actually saw a patient yesterday, and she said something about Fauci, and of course I have a gigantic mouth and I couldn't not say something. And I said, I don't think he's done a very good job. I'm trying to be gentle. And then she asked me later, I said, I wasn't going to get into debate. And I said, well, I think he's been kind of a shill for giant companies. And, the evidence I used is people that stay in jobs like that for 40 years or 50 years are usually far better politicians than they are scientists. And then I just left the conversation there.
Yeah. Well, that's very, very true. And every administration loved him because he was involved with exerting power and control and being smug about science. And I think they all just loved it, Democrat, Republican, until Trump came in. And maybe we can deal with that a little later, because he presented a whole new threat to these giant corporations. So I went into private practice. I was just going to see patients, and I've been in private practice ever since. I left NIMH in 1968 to today. I've been seeing patients. I probably haven't missed 2 weeks in the whole time of seeing a patient. And it's been very, very satisfying. But something else happened along the way, and that is in 1972, I found out that psychosurgery was coming back, lobotomy, and it kind of died out. And I hadn't yet figured out that the reason why psychosurgery died out, lobotomy, was because the antipsychotic drugs, by disrupting dopamine neurotransmission to the frontal lobes, are producing lobotomies chemically. And that just felt much nicer to the profession. And there was much more money to be made for everybody, because hardly any psychiatrists wanted to actually try to become surgeons. And so the lobotomization went on a mass level through psychiatric prescriptions on the wards of the state mental hospitals, and to a much lesser extent in the society in general. Now society is like a mental hospital. As many people in our society are on drugs as used to be on drugs in the mental hospitals. I mean, probably 40% of people are going to have taken psychiatric drugs at least at some time, and maybe probably more. I mean, we get data like 20% of women are on antidepressants. So, I mean, we have this huge section of people on drugs. So we've turned the society into a kind of a mental hospital. And this is all this I didn't know or suspect is the prelude to COVID-19. So I went into reform work. I did my private practice, and then I started writing books, scientific books, medical books, actual textbooks, critical of the medical model, critical of the drugs, developed theories that all psychiatric treatments work by disabling the brain, and the theory is still appropriate to everything we see scientifically. All the interventions in the brain that we have simply reduce the brain processes. ultimately with long-term disastrous effects, sometimes short-term disastrous effects, and that the drugs work only if somebody prefers the person to be disabled. And often human beings find life so difficult. I mean, it's so hard for us humans that we end up wanting to be disabled. We drink, we smoke dope, which is a very subduing of our brain functions, our mental functions. We do everything we can to find a way out of this pain and difficulty of being a human being. So many people feel relief when they have a disability introduced into their brain. If they're psychotic, they might rarely even feel the drugs help, because in reducing overall brain function, there's less terrifying, less humiliating hallucinations and delusions going on. But it's all at the expense of the overall human function. And in fact, there is no key to removing a mental problem from the brain physically. I mean, you just can't go in and pluck it out. I remember the psychosurgeons were so simple-minded, and I think we probably see the same thing today in transhumanism. This was early transhumanism. My wife, when we recently were discussing all this, she said, "Honey, you were the first person to really stand up ferociously against transhumanism when you took 4 or 5 years out of your life and fought the psychosurgeons." I got a commission established. I mean, it was quite a task, a federal commission, a psychosurgery commission that actually ruled it experimental, which was a huge blow to them. And I got federal legislation introduced to stopping federal funding. That did not get approved, but it certainly scared the hell out of them. And then I was an expert in a huge Kamowitz trial, which stopped psychosurgery in a state mental hospital. I set up my testimony so the judges could apply the Nuremberg Code to mental hospital patients, that they were in prison, they were not free, they couldn't be volunteering for psychosurgery. And the three-judge panel in Michigan agreed with me. And that stopped psychosurgery in all the federal institutions. They didn't want to go up against that. And the Supreme Court, they were afraid at that time, if they appealed it, would rule against the psychosurgeons. It's so patently ridiculous to go in and either cut or melt, holes in the brain with heated electrodes. It just makes no sense to anybody except somebody who is very much like the people who run COVID-19, a predator, basically.
So what year was that when the federal institution stopped doing psychosurgery?
About 73, because the trial was in 73. I started the campaign in 72. And then that was followed by the commission several years later, which ruled it experimental, which just vastly cut back on all the psychosurgery around the world. I went to Europe and I gave talks there. I was involved in multiple lawsuits against the psychosurgeons. Their insurances went up. Their insurances got canceled. It was a kind of thing only a very young and angry man is going to do. And I really, it was just my life. And it was before Ginger. So I was on my own, basically trying to organize different groups, women's groups. A lot of this was very racist. They were operating little black children in Mississippi, walking around on wards, these abandoned kids in institutions with electrodes hanging out of their heads. And then they were promoting psychosurgery for the control of violence. And they got money from NIMH and the Justice Department to do psychosurgery at Harvard. And I shut them down. And they actually connected their psychosurgery to the idea that ghetto rioters, the leaders, had something wrong with their brains because not everybody was rioting. I mean, bizarre kinds of just Neanderthal thinking in terms of politics and the genuine racism that was there at the time. Yeah?
What I was going to say, I think a lot of people don't realize, and maybe not in the medical profession, but our listeners that aren't medical, is that, The whole gist of it, like you said, was all the social implications and control, not just, it's like new the lobotomies and the surgery was like, well, let's attempt to cut something bad out of the brain, like you would say for a cancer treatment. It's like, it's bad, let's go in there, let's cut it out, let's take it out, and then it won't affect the person. I mean, that wasn't really the attitude of what you're saying with the lobotomies. I mean, they're experimenting, they're using it as social control, way beyond and past the part where they knew that it was could be used for greater things. Correct? Does that make sense?
Well, some of them were going in quite a remarkable fashion. Well, the Harvard the Harvard neurosurgeon, he was the head of neurosurgery at Harvard. He was arguably the most admired or powerful physician in the world, William Sweet, head of neurosurgery at Mass General. And I remember I got a phone call from the assistant director of NIMH, who was not a physician. He was an administrator whom I'd been friendly with when I was there. And I went in, visited with him, and he tried to warn me away from taking on the psychosurgeries. He said, Peter, you're a psychiatrist. You try to debate these guys, they'll eat you alive. And the interesting thing was that we debated a few times, and then they wouldn't go near me. Because I developed this little quip that you really don't have to be a brain surgeon to be a brain surgeon.
I love it.
I mean, being a butcher would be fine. And I would argue with them. I would say, listen, the brain's an integrated organ. Eventually, it's all tied together. We have the anatomy of all the networks. Neurons don't stand alone. You kill one neuron, you're going to damage or kill a series of neurons over time. We knew this from head injury. And they accused me of being an integrationist of the brain.
Wow. An integrationist of the brain? Did they make that up?
They made it up. I don't think it existed before then, because
what is that?
First of all, anybody with a brain knows the brain is extraordinarily integrated. It may be the single most integrated space in the world, folks. The most complex, integrated, interdependent space in the universe is between your ears.
Well, yeah, right. But I think the obvious comeback is, so you are a brain disintegrator? Is that what you want to do?
That's
Obviously,
right.
That's what you want to do.
Exactly.
Yes.
Wow.
But then there was a gentleman who was gotten a great medal from the Spanish dictator at the time, and he was at Yale. I'm blocking on his name right now. And he worked with the Harvard psychiatrists, putting remote control devices on the heads of some of the patients. And they would stimulate the patient on the ward without the patient knowing what was happening. Or they would burn a hole in his brain without his even knowing he was like in surgery, because they had control of the system, the short distances away on the ward. They had their equipment right there. And this was funded by NIMH.
This sounds like it's like something you'd see in a horror movie.
Well, it was a horror story that was fictionalized before I came along by one of the greatest science writer of all time, who wrote Terminal Man. Some of this stuff I haven't thought about in a while, so I'm not pulling out those names so fast. But and I wrote to him and I said, look, here's the real story about these operations. And so he actually put an introduction into a paperback about how he'd been misled by these doctors to thinking this could work. And then that lasted for, I think, one edition of the paperback. And then, of course, he was just overwhelmed, I'm sure, with assault, and he withdrew from the fray. But that was the beginning. And then people said, well, what about shock treatment? And God, I'm still fighting shock treatment. We have a quite a big suit that's moving along successfully now against the shock manufacturers in North America. There's only two of them. And then I started looking at the psych drugs, and I realized that if you look at the drawing of where the antipsychotic drugs are working, they're doing a lobotomy. All of them. And that now includes things like people take all the time, like Seroquel and Risperdal and Abilify and so on. I mean, many of them masquerading as antidepressants when they're neuroleptic antipsychotics, that is dopamine blockers. They're blocking the major trunks from deeper in the brain to the frontal lobes, and they all result in apathy and indifference, which is the goal of all totalitarianism. Just to make a leap for you, it's apathy and indifference with a suitable enough functionality that you will do what the work is required of you.
I guess so I like to play devil's advocate because that's what I do really well. And so I would
That's
challenge.
her love language. Devil's advocate is her love language.
But I like to speak to the opposing side and say, so I guess what would be the alternative that you would promote? And that would be if someone's struggling so much with their mental illness that it's overwhelming, that they choose to have the apathy over the horrible thoughts or feelings that's disabling their life. I mean, what are the alternatives? I mean, are you a proponent for more psychotherapy over that?
Well, I've also written a lot about this, but I don't get to talk about it much anymore, and I do this in therapy. I have a very interesting article that just got published about a year ago in one of the APA American Psychological Association journals, The Humanistic Psychologist. And what I talk about is what is the ultimate threat to human beings that completely demoralizes them. If you're looking at some 17-year-old girl, won't get out of bed, and she's hearing things, and she's terrified, and she thinks her dad has horns and her mother's from Mars, or whatever else is going on, but she's just terrified. Or the young boy who is just filled with violent and destructive feelings. Maybe he's thinking about murdering his classmates. And if you peel down and you peel down, what is going on? Well, ultimately, when a human being feels they're undeserving of love, they come apart. And I think that it's not even being unlovable. That's the step above it. I'm unlovable. I thought I was unlovable because I was too short. Everybody's pretty much got something they feel unlovable about. And I can trace that back to my family's attitudes. But beneath that more superficial, that I'm unlovable, is a sense that I don't deserve love. And, that's where Judaism and Christianity fit in. And I'm Jewish, but certainly I can appeal to most of my audience, which is Christian. And that's what Jesus was trying to overcome. He was trying to say, we should love one another and love God, and we are lovable. We are worthy of love as human beings. And that's the centerpiece. So all good therapy, I believe, and I believe this is true about all good therapy, even newfangled technological behavioral nonsense, is based on the quality of the relationship between the provider of help and the person being helped. And if people need to think they're being behaviorally treated or whatever, I guess that's too bad. But I just talk really frankly with people in my practice about this, that what happens is that in the most desperate situations, we kind of opt out of the fundamental beliefs of the founders of America. I've written a little book called oh Lord!
You've written so many that you can't remember them all. I love it because you have.
The little book got me in terrible trouble. I got zeroed out of way ahead of my time, out of New York for the book because of the title, which was "Wow, I'm an American." I lost my progressive agent, whom I'd known since childhood, when I wrote "Wow, I'm an American," and how to live like our heroic founders. Wow, I'm an American. Lovely little book. We had to self-publish it. I didn't have a lot of conservative connections at the time, and I believe that these fundamental values, that we have to take responsibility for ourselves, we have to respect freedom, And we have to have loving connections. The founders deeply believed in a moral society. So what I try to do with people is I try to work with them on actually treasuring themselves, not self-esteem, not because they're wonderful, not because they're great, but because we're born on earth, we're children of God, if they can bear hearing about God, which a lot of people here in Ithaca, New York, where I work, can't because of Cornell and the progressive influences. So then we try some other kind of approach to why people are inherently lovable. And that when you were a baby, you were lovable. If you'd been born in a more loving family, a lot of things would be different for you, although life is always hard anyway. And that you need to treat yourself like a treasure, and you need to treat other people in the same way. And that is the beginning. And everything will begin to change. But you also have to take responsibility for it. You can't say anymore, well, my mother did this to me, which you learned in your 3 years of psychoanalytically oriented therapy. Yes, there are a lot of bad things happen. I talk about that with people too, but only if they will take responsibility for outgrowing it. You have to be able to say, this happened to me, or I was Jewish and I ran into a lot of anti-Semitism, or I'm black and I'm every time somebody looks at me cross-eyed, I think it's because I'm black, and sometimes it is, but a lot of times it isn't, and it gets all very complicated. Yeah, that's all tough. And there is racism, and then there's just people being not nice to each other. But we have to triumph over it by having a loving attitude toward ourselves and other human beings. And by loving oneself, I don't mean anything narcissistic that we usually think about. I mean that you realize that you're a part of this great creation and you should take care of yourself. You should value yourself and take.
I love that. So a little bit sort of devil's advocate stuff on some of the medication thing is, if it does create a little bit of apathy and you have a overactive, if you're anxious, so everything is way too important, part of anxiety is you're paying way too much attention to things that you need to ignore. And so if medication helps you kind of tamp down some of that, so that you can ignore that better, maybe it actually opens you, there's times where it actually opens you up so then you can, receive appropriate therapy, counsel, talking to a friend, etc. Because, some of the noise, the psychological noise is kind of turned down.
Well, everything is turned down. And what we need in order to be human beings and to handle the inevitable difficulties of being a human being is the most intact brain we can have. The most intact brain we can have. And for that, you want a drug-free brain. You want to eat as much of a plant-based diet as you can do, and you want to have mild exercise. But above all things, you want to have loving relationships. And the first thing to go with drugs is love. Doesn't matter what the drug is. Smoking, drinking, that highest function of that fine-tuning of really taking joy in the existence of another human being. That's my definition of love. It works pretty well. I view love as joy in the awareness of anything. I love trees. I see a tree growing after a rainstorm, and I just love that tree, and I'm so glad for the rain. I love my wife. I love my mother-in-law. I love talking on the radio and television and sharing with people. Loving, taking joy and being aware of what you're doing is the key. And if you dampen that, you've actually pretty much destroyed the center of recovery. The other thing is that, to use modern language, you are now a transformed human being. You're one of these trans people they want to make, that Schwab wants to make. You're part of transhumanism. You've been changed, and it suggests that you are not good enough to grow. The other thing it suggests very dramatically is that your therapist feels you're hopeless by ordinary means. And I've told therapists, if therapy isn't working, and then you think a drug is needed, take it yourself. Because who's to say the patient is the reason the therapy is not working?
No, I like that. I've been, the whole SSRI thing just, I remember there was a meta-analysis about 10 years ago, and basically if you looked at where SSRIs crossed placebo, I mean, these are patients that were so wildly depressed that they weren't, getting out of bed or taking a shower. This is not who the vast majority of people that take SSRIs are. They feel kind of sad, and so it's all the soccer moms who have to deal with, a less than loving husband and 4 kids and whatever. I mean, that's what makes the industry. And in that regard, I totally agree with you. I think that there's been wild over prescription, kind of this, everyone's walking around in the Pink Floyd comfortably numb stage. And then, like, I love what you just said, and then it blocks true recovery. And I think that's the case. I mean,
I'm just thinking about in our training, and even, how some of the analogies we still use with patients, we've been trained to say, well, the brain is like your pancreas. People with diabetes that stop producing insulin, they take a medication for that. Or you have resistant hypertension, so you do all the things, you cut back your sodium, you exercise, you lose weight, but sometimes your blood pressure's high, and the brain's like that too. You try
It's materialism.
Right. It's you do the things, you have the good support networks, but sometimes the brain's just not functioning right. So we need to adjunct that with medication. And that's what we've been taught, like in med school and our training, through pharma, through everywhere. It's like, this is an adjunct to help you, and it's okay. And I mean, I would say that to patients too. Ultimately, I believe what you're saying is that, I mean, a lot of what's going on now is a societal, social problem. I mean, I don't know if it's first world problem, but I don't know if I know I've done mission trips, and you walk into some of these third world countries and people aren't on all kinds of antidepressants and antipsychotics, and they have some of the most joy I've ever seen in people in my life.
And they kill themselves at fractional rates compared to the developed
so
world.
That's why I'm like, what are we doing? Because we're not doing things right.
Well, we're doing exactly what we're doing under COVID-19. We're being turned into less than human. We're being turned into more docile people. And I can get into that in great depth, because one of the things that our book, COVID-19 and the Global Predators, does is it looks at what's common about all this. But I can draw you in further through psychiatry. I mean, because I went on to do, but you probably don't even know this about me. I wrote a best-selling book about the Prozac catastrophe in 1994 called Talking Back to Prozac. We sold nearly 1 million copies.
Yes, when it's on your web page, I was looking through your bio on your web page, and I was like, you wrote that? Oh my gosh! Yeah, I know that book well.
I was also chosen by a federal court, or confirmed by a federal court, and chosen by a consortium of attorneys in about 1993 or 4 to be the single scientific expert for all the medical concepts, research, discovery for a massive lawsuit against Eli Lilly, and with 150 lawyers or more. And in that process, I became one of the early people to run into the establishment that is giving us COVID-19. And their reaction was incredible. But probably the most remarkable thing was they actually, we had the first big trial that was going to be sort of the flagship trial. And I looked at it and I said, it's practically unwinnable. This is the best trial you could come up with, best case. Because the man who had committed mass murder, nobody wants to let a mass murderer off. He'd done mass murder at work. And besides that, he'd been hospitalized for being paranoid about mass murder before he ever got on Prozac. All I could say was that clearly the Prozac pushed him over the top, because he was put on Prozac and he came back the next week and was psychotic for the first time grossly that the psychiatrist had ever seen. Psychiatrist actually thought maybe this is the Prozac. See, they weren't so brainwashed yet. It was very early on. Maybe this is, and took him off the Prozac, but it was too late. The next day or two, he went out and he murdered all these people, or about a dozen people, wounded about 20. It was a bizarre trial to try to win. And then I realized they weren't preparing me for the case. And my wife said, way ahead of my thinking, this is fixed. Then I got there and it was fixed. I couldn't get the judge's attention on what was happening. And I ended up giving my testimony by asking myself questions. It's quite bizarre if you look at my testimony, because they wouldn't ask me the key questions. I'd say, and a related issue is, and a related issue. And everybody was objecting, including my side. And we still, I think it was just my testimony, got two jurors to say no. So they won by one more vote, said no, they would have lost. And then it was written up as this massive victory, and the whole case collapsed. And then I was very discouraged. I was pretty sure it was fixed. It was just a terrible experience. And then about 8 months later, an attorney said to me, did you hear the trial you were in were fixed? The judge determined it was fixed, literally. They exchanged money in return for not bringing a strong case. And I thought, oh, God. They were also trying to get me. I was the only medical person in the world standing up on these issues. And so they wanted to get me, and they wanted to get the, to get the first case. So, but I was kind of deluded back then. It's a common delusion. And my delusion was the world is not all that evil. It's just this lousy pharmaceutical, psychiatric drug, lobotomy connection. Psychiatry is fundamentally evil in that it reduces people to being more helpless than they began. Another key to helping people is that the many people who come for help feel helpless. Not all, and those will be people who are doing relatively well. And in every area a person's failing, they're feeling helpless, and they think they're feeling helpless because they're failing. No, they're failing because they're helpless. They got keyed into childhood responses of being unlovable and unworthy of love and helpless. And they get stuck there, and you want to help them out of that position. But psychiatry reinforces it. You go to your psychiatrist and you say, oh, God, I feel like I'm so depressed. I think I have clinical depression. I meet all the checklists online. Now I say, oh, you do. It's biochemical. Well, that's transhumanism. That's reducing you to an object. That's materialism. It's all related closely, actually, to the materialism of communism and progressivism. It's a tight bundle that we begin to dissect in our book. But I was deluding myself really up until COVID-19. And when COVID-19 struck, it sounded so familiar to me. It sounded like everything I already knew about corruption in the pharmaceutical industry and in the medical profession, writ much, much larger than I imagined. And Ginger and I thought about it, and should we go into this? And we were cautious. I was proud of my designation as the Conscience of Psychiatry. I was the cutting edge of being critical of psychiatry, and would I ruin that whole thing? Ginger and I both thought it was God's intention for the two of us, after she joined me, to be standing up on these issues, as no psychiatrist was willing to do, and still isn't.
Well, right. All of a sudden, someone would say, wow, what a stretch. Someone in psychiatry is taking a stand on what we're doing with COVID. Like, what the heck is that all about? But obviously, with your whole background, what you've seen going on, as you've explained, there's such a parallel that, you can't help but see it.
But it's not just psychiatry.
No, that's the delusion I had, that it was psychiatry.
It's the medical. I've talked about this for 20 years. It's the medical industrial complex.
And now it's much bigger. Let me jump ahead. Let me go. Is it time for me to go to the truth?
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yep.
here's what happened with me and Ginger. So we're mulling about this. We started to write a little blog about some of these things we saw going on. And then Ginger brings me an article. She said, honey, this popped up on Twitter somewhere. I don't know. I found it. I had to hunt. It's a real article. I think, is this an article? It's very weird. We were making SARS-CoV viruses in our own labs. And when you say SARS-CoV, you mean a virus that is a pandemic virus. SARS means the acute respiratory illness that is so severe, although it turns out it's much more complex than this respiratory. And CoV means, these particular kinds of viruses. So we have SARS-CoV-2 now. But this article in 2015 was about making SARS-CoV viruses out of harmless bat viruses. We thought, what is going on here? What in the heck is this about? Now, this is March. And we stewed on it, and we looked at it, and I started looking into it, and I learned about Fauci, and I said, oh, my God, this is funded by NIAID and NIH, and it's Fauci's stuff. And then I said, looking at Ginger retire, I said, God, honey, look at this. I thank God you brought me this. You see, there are two Chinese names here. I don't want to be racist, I mean, we're not supposed to do that anymore. And, all right, so, well, where are they from? And there it is down there. They're from the special labs at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Exactly.
And I'm thinking, wait a minute. We're fussing around that it's a conspiracy, that this was released accidentally, and I now believe it was purposeful, but that's just so horrific. We can leave it for a little later. But and people call it conspiracy theory, and we were making these viruses with them. And then there was another article in 2016, and the famous bat lady, Li Mengyan, not Li Mengyan, is a wonderful, wonderful one. Xi Zhenling, the bat lady, God bless.
Bat lady.
Somehow she got the name as the bat lady because she was like the world authority on bat viruses.
Yeah. And then we looked a little further. I was still naive. I hadn't read any books yet about China and how they'd infiltrated every aspect of our culture. I was not prepared for what we were about to discover in our own way. And then we see that she's not a co-author of the next article coming out of NIH and Fauci, and it's all out of North Carolina with this guy Barrick but there's an acknowledgement thanking the bat lady for helping build the protein, the spike protein. So what is going on here? This is like a weapon. I mean, forget what the Chinese did or didn't do. We're helping the Chinese make biological weapons. And then I find out, as I'm continuing to learn, that in January, the Chinese became more out in the open. They appointed their chief biological warfare expert to be the director of the Wuhan Institute. It's probably the first time you heard this. But it's there. It's in the newspapers.
So January 2020 or January 2019?
January 2020. Just after it got started, I think they figured they needed to have the big boss in there.
Yeah, and then they blamed the United States for creating the virus in their military labs.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we were able to go then, Ginger and I, and track a whole series of funded studies from NIMH, NIH, from the Defense Department funding too, through DARPA, the Defense Department Special Agency for Advanced Warfare stuff, DARPA, they were funding too, not just Fauci and NIH. And it was clear that there was a long line of SARS viruses being developed by these people. In fact, they developed one in North Carolina, a SARS-CoV that was killing mice at a very high rate with encephalitis. So that thing is out there somewhere in the labs of the world because they trade, They share things. So we said, well, look, it looks like Peter Breggin and Ginger Breggin have the same role that, I started with and she joined me with. And we do deep dives into science, corruption in science, deep dives. So we got to dive. And we set this up, and we did a blog about it on, I think it was April 15th. And I did a video, which very quickly went to 40,000, even though YouTube was obviously suppressing my stuff. Immediately went to 40,000. And we used, done something I hadn't done for decades. I used to do this all the time when I was doing stopping psychosurgery decades ago. We got in contact with people that we knew the president's group, family, and so on. Told them about what we had just released, sent it to them, and 2 days later, the president canceled the funding of this research making lethal viruses with China. He announced it and he did it. But he didn't stop the overall what's called gain of function research. It's really gain of lethal function research.
Yeah, because the gain of function research was initially stopped in the Obama administration. And then my understanding is that early on, like 2017, shortly after Trump was in office, they got that lifted.
It's more interesting and complicated than that, obviously. I mean, it always is. And in the book, we go into that in some detail. Obama did put a moratorium. There was a lot of outcry about gain of function work with flu viruses. Why are we making more vicious flu viruses? And the whole excuse, by the way, for this is vaccines. A lot of this is vaccines.
Or at least to get ahead of it so that we wouldn't have another
Right.
problem like we did with SARS, the original SARS,
right.
so that we could actually have, armamentarium and a way to combat it if it came out again.
So original SARS comes out.
Let me say that Obama put a moratorium on White House stationery on it, and Fauci simply ignored it. It did not stop one bit. This lying man who tells Congress he's never funded through NIH or NIH, he's never funded gain of function research, continued funding the epitome of gain of function research, the making of SARS-CoV viruses in cooperation with the Chinese communists. So it went on. And then they formally lifted it without the involvement of President Trump toward the end of the first year of his administration.
The thing that I get, I guess where it gets complicated, just sort of in my own head, is, their countervailing argument is, well, we're doing gain of function testing so that if there is a pandemic that naturally occurred from something really dangerous, we'll already have a head start with a vaccine, with a therapeutic, with multiple bullets in the chamber, so to speak, and so. Because where this
isn't that behind the whole Johns Hopkins publication in 2017
about the SPARS virus,
SPARS project, so that they would be prepared.
So they'd be prepared,
kind of like a fire drill in case of a fire.
And where this is like a criminal. This is like a criminal.
No, it isn't. It's a money drill, and then you make a fire.
Right. No, that I think that's probably the case. The thing that's interesting though is it's sort of like a criminal. It's sort of like a criminal case, right? If you back out of your driveway and accidentally, drive over your grandchild and kill them, it's an accident. If you intentionally drive over somebody with malice, then it's murder. And so, the one side says we're doing gain of function testing because it's the greatest thing for humanity because we're gonna be ahead and we're gonna wipe out any pandemic when it first starts. The skeptical side is you shouldn't be doing it at all. You're kind of playing God. And secondly, these organizations have a tremendous record of corruption, so no one should really trust them with the keys to the kingdom, so to speak.
Let me give you. There's just a ton more information which transforms this discussion way beyond where it is right now. So let me try to move into that. And let me say a word about the book, because everything I'm going to now be talking about and have been talking about is in the manuscript, and you can get the manuscript today by buying in advance the book. We've done something that I don't believe any other authors have ever done, and that is if you go to www.wearetheprey, just We Are the Prey, it's the subtitle of the book and the dedicated website. You can also go to breggin.com on my website, breggin.com. But since you thought it'd be easier for people to go to a dedicated website and you didn't have to remember how to spell Breggin, and it's We Are the Prey. And you don't have to know how to spell pray either, because you'll get there with either spelling of prey. It's my wife's organization.
I love it. The British or the American way.
So when you get there, you will be able to buy the book at a cut rate in advance. The book will hopefully be out this month. It may not be. It's a struggle, and God knows what we're going to meet at the end stages of it. But you will instantly get almost the exact manuscript that's coming out in the book, right in your mailbox, including with the remaining typos that haven't yet been found, and remaining mistakes that haven't yet been found.
Yeah, actually, Ginger already sent us your manuscript, and I was gleaning through it. Obviously, didn't read through the whole thing, but yes, I know our our listeners will love looking at that. Absolutely, we'll put that in our notes so they can find it, the show notes.
Wow, that was amazing. It's fascinating to talk to somebody with that much experience and that much passion, and he's still doing that, in his mid-80s. I think that's really mind-blowing. Some of it I kind of scratch my head, should, are medications wrong, psychotropic medications wrong for absolutely everybody? I don't know if he's really saying that, but I think, there's times where people need meds.
I know that there's times when, yes. I mean, we have people, let's call it a bridge, not a crutch, as some people will call it. I think it's a bridge to getting your life sorted out, because most of the time, a lot of these things are socially related, and people just want, it's America, we want a fast fix, we want to band-aid it, we want a pill for it to make it go away like everything else, whether it's weight loss. And the same with emotional things. There's a huge social component, and so I think there's a place for medication. Do I think that people need to be on it lifelong? No. And do I think we overuse it? Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the gestalt of this, the big picture is, and I've been harping about this for the last 15 years, is way too much medication, like way too much ADD medication, especially in young males. The fact that you have a crappy life and you feel sad doesn't mean you're really depressed. I think the thought-provoking nature of this has really challenged and supported a lot of what I've been kind of scratching my head and looking at. Like, I think this idea of what we've been trained to tell patients, which is you have a chemical imbalance, is largely bullshit. Like, it really is. I mean, it's usually you have a bad life or you've made poor decisions.
Well, you might have a chemical imbalance, but it's like saying you have when you're obese, you have a weight imbalance. I mean, it's true. How you go about fixing it, though, I think there's better ways. Right. And so that's what I found challenging about him, is that I don't think it's all or nothing, but I think we can do a lot better.
Yeah, I don't think it's all or nothing, but I think if we have the bullshitometer,
yes,
we're way more pegging the rev limiter in the you are a helpless, worthless person that needs pharmaceuticals to save you because you have a chemical imbalance. I think that's almost entirely wrong. I think that there definitely is a place for medications. And what I've told patients numerous times, especially over the last 10 years, is medication is not the answer. It might be part of the answer. And that's the same for diabetics. It's the same for, you can even go as far as in cancer patients. I mean, where you're really dependent on chemotherapy, you still have to do other lifestyle things that may make a difference as well. So super thought-provoking. Love it. Next week's going to be, even a little bit more intense. Not quite as long, but I can't wait. All right, man.
Right. And, to get more validation on where Dr. Breggin's coming from, you can check out his website at Breggin, that's BREGGIN.com. His resume is impressive. It's pages and pages long, about his whole career, publications, all his books. He actually has a YouTube channel as well as a radio show. And when I started looking at his book publications, I went, I know this guy. How embarrassing. I didn't even realize who he was until we interviewed him. So really impressive.
But does he, okay, so he's written 24 books, but does he ride Harleys? I mean, like, really? Everyone has their limits, right?
I guess Harleys may be sexier than books. I don't know. Anyway, come back next week where this conversation continues. Meanwhile, we want to thank our sponsor this week, which is CareCloud. Huge shout out to them. Don't let bad billing processes keep you from your hard-earned revenue. CareCloud's free revenue cycle assessment uncovers billing mistakes so you can see how to claim every last dollar. We all want every last dollar. Get your free assessment by visiting them at drpodcastnetwork.com/CareCloud. Again, that's drpodcastnetwork.com/CareCloud. Don't wait. CareCloud is ready to help your practice thrive.
Stop bleeding money!
Save all the money you can.
It's no secret that medicine is a bit, uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS Free MD, to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS Free MD. See you next time.
While we try to keep BS Free MD as raw and real as possible, we can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bsfreemd.com.